Thanks for coming. Sorry about the phone. My niece, Taya, my sister's daughter, is in the Squamish and Kings County spelling championships right now. I think she just spelled cantata correctly, so I think she's through the second round. Last year, she was in this competition as well. I remember this is streamed live on a local TV station in Seattle. It's for the sort of championship of Seattle spelling bee. And she is one of these kids who just does things that she likes to do. And she saw that movie, the spelling, somebody in the bee, and thought a spelling bee would be fun to do. So she enters this school competition, she wins it, and she goes to this citywide competition, and we're all watching online, and all of her uncles are sort of failed athletes, and we're just hoping that she doesn't embarrass herself and she can get through the first round. And there's like 80 kids, like the smartest kids in Seattle, up on this stage, and she gets through the first round, and we think, well, that's good, now she won't humiliate herself, because we have very negative thinking in our family. And then she gets to the second round, and then the third round, and the fourth round, and the fifth round, the sixth round. Finally, it's down to her and this other kid. And we think, now we're very ambivalent, because we want her to win, and it seems to be possible she could win, and yet the humiliation of the disappointment of losing now would be even greater than having lost earlier before. So we're sort of in this tortured conflict about how to get Tay out of this experience. And she misses a word, so we think that's over. But it turns out in spelling bees, you have to spell the last word correctly. You can't just get out on somebody else's loss. So this poor kid gets his word spelled wrong. So she's back in it. They go back and forth, and finally he makes a mistake. And then she gets acetylene, which is, who can spell acetylene? Hey. She wins, she won. Taya was the champion of Seattle. She goes to the Nationals, she's on ESPN. She has such a good time, even though she came in, I think, 13th in the country out of 5 million people. She's back at it today. I guess she won her school again, and I'm just following the family's tweets as we go through. I think she spelled, they give them easy words to begin with to get out the people who shouldn't be there. So she has rehearsed in cantata. Maybe by the end of the afternoon, we'll have more information. But today we're going to talk mostly about these winding stories, and for some reason, at the last minute, it seemed like my family was insinuating itself more and more into this narrative. My other brothers and I, well, actually my other brothers, two of my brothers went up to Ely, Minnesota years ago to see my brother Bart, who was a canoe guide in the Boundary Waters area, which basically meant he had to portage, carry these enormous canoes between lakes and mountains, and he built up these enormous legs. And we'd go up and see him once a summer, and we'd paddle around with him. Both, one of my brothers and I rowed in college, so we had this ability to turn an idyllic experience up in the high lake region of Canada and Minnesota into competitions. We tried to out-paddle, these sort of couples who were out for a week or so in the wilderness. But in order to get up to Ely, we had to hitchhike from Minnesota. And we had a really terrible time getting rides. In fact, we had to spend a couple of nights, first night in a field, and then the second night, I think I was with my brother Josh, who'd spent some time in Europe, and for some reason that gave him these survival skills that I lacked. As we realized we were going to be trapped in this city, he started collecting old newspapers as it got darker and darker. And I didn't know why. He was sort of ridiculing me for not being prepared, and it was sort of like the grasshopper and the ant story. As by the time the night it got dark and we were in the sort of town square, Josh had stuffed all the newspapers in his pants and his jacket, and he lay down. And I, who had scoffed at this behavior because he was kind of dumpster diving to get this done, was very cold. So he gave me some of the comic section of his newspaper, and we got through the night. We went up. We spent a week rowing around with my brother, and then we had to go back, and we were hitchhiking back. And I remember that afternoon, we just hiked out of the wilderness. We're on this road, and we looked worse than ever, and nobody's picking us up. And Josh starts to tell me a story about a movie he'd just seen, The In-Laws, which was a Peter Falk and the Alan Arkin comedy. Arthur Hiller directed, and it's a kind of a complicated romp. It's like Alan Arkin is a mild-mannered dentist in New York City, and his daughter is marrying a young man whose father is Peter Falk, who is this mysterious businessman who's always telling stories about going down to Guatemala. And Arkin begins to suspect he's a crook. And this is exacerbated when Falk asks him if he'll break into his safe because he has some documents there. One thing leads to another, and soon they're down in Central America. Falk is a CIA agent and a sort of rogue agent who's stolen some plates, 100 billion plates for counterfeit money, and he's trying to entrap an insane dictator whose chief advisor is his own hand that he speaks to, sort of like it's called Senior Pepe or something. And the story is very complicated because it sort of involves the growing realization on the part of one character that the other character is crazy, but then that he might not be crazy. And then as the circumstances get more and more complex, we begin to be drawn into the real drama of their story. And I remember standing by the road in this beautiful sunny day, listening to this story spin out. And I realized that it was far more pleasant to hear my brother tell the story of this movie than it ever possibly could have been to see the movie. I tested that proposition by seeing the movie later on, and it was not as good as the way Josh told it. Somehow reduced to the schematics and maybe the circumstances, this narrative was far more compelling than the actual orchestrated form. I think in the end they're like lined up against a wall to be shot, and then the CIA comes in, and it turns out everything's true, and they rescue him, and it turns out that he was supposed to give the dictator $10 million, but he actually had $20 million, so he gives the CIA $10 million, and then the two split the other two, so they have $5 million. They each can give their kids $1 million gift for their wedding. So it's a very nice story, but that the structure of the story reminded me of the last event, the CIA coming over the wall, is a kind of an example of Deus ex machina, this resolution of a story by some sort of almost divine intervention at the last minute. And as a sophisticated audience like this would know, it comes from Greek, mostly from Greek tragedies, where a machine, a hoist, a crane was called a mak or something, and they were fond of sort of resolving a conflict at the end of a story by hoisting the god in who would sort of set things right and put people in the right path. And it was used a lot. And the advantage of this kind of mechanism is you can create whatever kind of drama you want and whatever kind of resolution you want simply by appealing to this outside force. Of course, now it's become a much more derided technique because it creates a lack of internal logic in a story. If you can get out of it any way that you want, and it disrupts with the suspension of disbelief, which we'll get to in a second, which is essential to the way that we understand how story structure works. I need all these pages. The other systems that we need to keep in mind, especially, is another familiar concept to most of you, which is Chekhov's gun. Chekhov, the great Russian storyteller, said that stories had to be very parsimonious in the information that they gave. Everything had to fit. You didn't have one extraneous information that sort of trailed off in one direction or another and subtracted from the sort of momentum and the drive of the narrative towards whatever conclusion. So the example would be, if at the beginning of the story, over the mantelpiece of the hero, there is a hunting rifle, sometime before the end of the story, somebody has to shoot that rifle. If it doesn't happen, then we go away dissatisfied. When you look up these words online, you link to other concepts, which I also find kind of interesting. The big dumb object, which is a sort of derogatory principle or a term for kind of objects of great veneration, like the sphere in the movie Sphere, or the obelisk in 2001. Things that sort of emanate some sort of great power just by hovering there, and they become motivators. It occurred to me that, in movies where there's a work of art, which is the key, the work of art is usually portrayed as a big dumb object, because you can't actually show a work of art without being slightly anticlimactic, because somebody's not going to like what you do. So you're about to draw something, you're about to show something, and then when you see it, unless, I guess in the picture of Dorian Gray, Ivan Albright, who I just found out in my research was Madeleine Albright's stepfather, but you can use whatever. He was famous for these very intense, complicated images, and he was hired to make the final image of Dorian Gray at the end of the movie, where he's sort of, the horror of his actions is revealed, and because I guess they figured Albright's work would fit with that they actually showed that. They had hired his brother Melvin to do the first picture, but they fired him because he didn't, that's true actually, he didn't make as nice an image of the original Dorian Gray. But Albright had learned his craft by drawing these incredible images of soldiers who had been grievously wounded in World War II for journals, and that had affected the way he worked for the rest of his life. The most interesting and famous example of these storytelling conventions, of course, is the MacGuffin, which is mostly associated with Hitchcock, but was actually Pearl White, who was the star of the Perils of Pauline movies at the turn of the early part of the century, where it was a serial, and every week she would have to do something like jump off of a bridge or go down a waterfall. She was always on the run, and she usually had something that everybody else wanted, and she called it a weenie. And so weenie is the actual term, but Hitchcock called it a MacGuffin. MacGuffin is the thing that everybody wants, that drives the story ahead. He contended it didn't matter what it was. You just had to you had to believe that it was important enough to the characters to drive the action and to define their behavior. George Lucas said it had to be important. He said that like R2-D2 was a MacGuffin, and that we all had to care about it, but I'd take Hitchcock over George Lucas any day. He liked to tell a story about what a MacGuffin was. He said there were two men on a train, and in an old English compartment, and on the rack above one of them was a package, and the man who had just entered said, "What is that?" And he said, "It's what's in there." And he said, "It's a MacGuffin." He said, "What's a MacGuffin?" And he said, "Oh, a MacGuffin is a device for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands." And the man said, well, but there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. And the other man said, well, then that's not a MacGuffin. So he said that a MacGuffin is whatever, it's nothing. It's just whatever you would present it to be. But back to the concept of suspension of disbelief, which is important to our story. It was originally coined by Coleridge, the poet, when he was proposing a new kind of literature that was sort of the first time post-Enlightenment that an emphasis on realism was coming back into question. He felt like he couldn't tell his stories, the particular stories he wanted to tell, unless he could convince his audience to believe in a kind of a supernatural world which everybody had been trying to turn their back on. So he was writing specifically about his epic poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in which, as you may recall, a sailor shoots an albatross while on a ship that's in the sort of far north, I think. And immediately after that, the ship is becalmed, and the crew is convinced that the killing of the albatross is the cause of their misfortune, and they hang the albatross around his neck as a form of punishment or some kind of I guess it's supposed to mitigate the sin, but they drift for a while. Everybody dies but him. He's rescued eventually by a man who may or may not be the devil, and he's condemned to walk the earth telling his story for eternity about being mindful, I think. And so unless you believe, you wouldn't get much out of the story unless you were willing to believe that the albatross was somehow a supernatural force, and that there was some sort of divine punishment for the actions of the man. Some thought that this character is connected to various different stories. He had, I think Coleridge had a teacher who had been on a boat that had gone far north, but also the story of the wandering Jew is also cited as a precedent. This is one of those anti-Semitic canards. Apparently, as Christ was carrying the cross to his crucifixion, he stumbles on the doorstep of a Jew. I think he's a shoemaker, and the guy punches him or tells him to go away, and Jesus says something like, well, wait or something till I come back. And so now this guy can't die until there's a second coming. So he's wandering around, begging forgiveness for his sins. It's funny, there's also a Tolstoy story called Kreuzer's Sonata, which also takes place on a train, oddly enough, in which people are talking about love. We'll get to this later on, but this man has killed his wife, and he has to ride this train telling everybody his story for as long, I don't know, as long as the story goes. This idea of eternal life being a punishment as opposed to death sort of functions, I guess, when we're talking about suspension of disbelief, in a sort of within a worldview where there is some sort of divine eternal reward for behavior on earth. And so if you've created a grievous sin while on earth and you cannot die, it's a horrifying proposition. But most of us, just staying alive is sort of enough of a short-term goal to keep us preoccupied. But oddly enough, my brother, who told me the story about the in-laws, came back with a real story from Africa that somewhat changed my thinking about this. He went to Africa to work in medical clinics for a while, and he told a story about treating, he was out in the provinces, and he met a man who was seriously ill. In fact, he was dying. But what the disease that he had was treatable with certain antibiotics that were not available in this small town. But if he went to the big city, which was several days' journey away, he could get this medicine and in all probability would survive. What my brother told him was, well, it was just that. And the journey would cost, let's say, $200. And there was a 90% chance that he would survive. And when the man heard this, he said, well, I'm going to stay here. And he said, why? He said, I have $200. That's basically all that I have. I would use all my money up if I went to the city to get this medicine. But I would have no money left. And if I went to the city and I died, then all my kinsmen would have to come to the city to bring my body back. And that would be a huge imposition on them. If I stay here and die, I will be with my ancestors as I'm supposed to be, and there will be no problem. So for him, it was a very straightforward proposition. To go to the city, to risk everything he had for a few more years, that would simply involve somebody having to get him back to the village where he would live and die with his ancestors, was an option that seemed was clearly less important or powerful to him than the reality of staying where he felt he belonged and being at sort of eternal rest with the people who he expected to be with. And that notion of life being a kind of a relative value in comparison to a larger sense of your placement in the world was a revelation at the time. As I'm telling the story now, I realize it's sort of embedded in this worldview that we secularists have lost touch with. But that reminds me in a slightly different way of another story that Josh brought back from Africa with my brother Tom, which is probably more close to something that we can relate to, at least I could. They were near a preserve in Africa, and they were outside a fence late at night, and I'm not quite sure under what other circumstances they were, but they saw an enormous elephant by the fence. And it occurred to one of them, probably Josh, that they could climb this fence and go see the elephant up close. And they were preparing to do this when Tom said, we need to apply the New York Times test to this situation. And Josh said, what's that? He said, okay, we're going to climb over this fence. We're going to go see this elephant. There's a possibility that the elephant will stomp us and maul us. And then the headline in the newspaper will be, 2 Americans mauled by elephant, and then the subheadline will be, climbed fence late at night to get into game park. And anybody reading that story will say, what a bunch of fucking idiots. What a stupid way to die. The Darwinian proposition is alive and well. It's a good thing that and so let's not do it. In other words, if you can envision the headline that accompanies your demise, and it is sufficiently dramatically insipid that no one will have sympathy for you, then you should probably not pursue that line of activity. Because basically most of us are not inclined to extend our sympathy to others in dire straits unless circumstances demand it. Right? We need to somehow separate ourselves from the disaster that's lurking around us, and anything, I wouldn't say that's a trivial distinction between somebody who's like run over by an avalanche and somebody who climbs a fence late at night to go see an elephant, but that was enough to sort of to make them shy away from something which could have tragic results. I guess I'm glad for that. But at this point, I'm thinking I'm going to indulge in a little bit of Deus Ex Machina myself. We're thinking about, the theme is about withholding response from something that's being demanded of you. As I was thinking about this, I got a letter, an email from my friend Judy, asking me a question. Because she's a musician and a playwright, and she's writing a play about conductors. And one of these themes in this story is a sort of perfect pitch, the idea of a gift that musicians have. There's relative and there's perfect pitch, but if the common notion is if you have perfect pitch, then you can distinguish notes absolutely, and it's sort of the musical equipment equivalent, I guess, of having photographic memory. When my niece Ellie came back from Washington, D.C. for the finalists, she told a story, and I think this story was also related, but the two guys who won had this photographic memory. So unlike all the other spellers who had to sort of remember Greek and the Latin roots and all sorts of systems of definitions and origins in order to sort of parse out words, they simply looked at the page, and when they were asked if they were worried about the last word they had to spell, they said no, because they'd seen the page. The page was in their heads. So the ability to sort of short-circuit this system and get right to the essence of a piece of information was certainly appealing. But what Judy wanted to know was, if this existed in the world of music, did something similar exist in the world of visual arts? In other words, are there people who have perfect color sense? Which I have no idea about. In the art world I operate in, that sort of skill is few and far between. So I asked a couple of painter friends, including two who actually worked for paint companies doing color matching, and they said, as far as they knew, there was not such a thing as somebody. There were people who were very good at it, but it didn't seem like there was a kind of inherent ability that distinguished some people from another. Although when you look up like what Velázquez could do, this is an acquired skill. He basically painted with 9 colors. The primaries, the secondaries, brown, black, and white, and he could mix. The idea was that he could always mix with one, without mistake, any color that he wanted at any point on the palette, which is an appealing idea. But it sort of got me thinking about another sort of segue off of this line, which is this sort of notion of synesthesia, the sort of mixture of senses, colors, and letters or numbers that some people possess, which seems like another gift along the lines of perfect pitch or a photographic memory that would sort of allow you to see or react to the world in a way that most of us can never hope to do. For some reason, that story made me think about a more well-known idea about how certain kinds of stimulations can demand of us a certain reaction that we don't want to necessarily give it. In this case, it's the old Monty Python skit, the killer joke, the perfect joke. And according to this story, I think a professional joke writer in the middle of, I think it was the Second World War, writes a joke which is so funny that he reads it and immediately keels over and dies. And then his mother comes in and she reads it. She thinks he's had a heart, and she dies. So then the Scotland Yard has to come in to try and retrieve this letter off the desk. And like one brave detective comes in, he's trying not to see it, he sees it, he laughs, he dies. So then they have to basically somehow transport it to their laboratories, break it into all the different parts, and they're trying to weaponize this joke. They give one word to a bunch of different translators. They each translate it into a German word. One translator by accident sees two words and has to spend 6 months in hospital. But eventually they have this word together, and they go out and they begin shouting this. It's in the skit, you don't know what the word is. It's just a bunch of gobbledygook. But sure enough, it works. The Germans are like laughing and falling over. They try to create their own joke, I think, but their joke is not as effective. I think it's two peanuts are walking down the street, and one peanut is a salted peanut. It didn't work. Eventually, I think the joke is, after the war, is buried under a monument to the unknown joke. It's a very clever story, but it turns out that there are many antecedents to this. I think Lil Abner, the Al Cap cartoon strip, had a similar story a few years before the Monty Python skit aired about a killer joke that Bob Hope is going to read on the air, but then Lil Abner, who's sort of illiterate, reads the joke and doesn't get it, so he puts his own joke in, and the world is saved because Bob Hope reads this bad joke that only Lil Abner likes. Arthur C. Clarke wrote a story called The Ultimate Melody, about a song which is so beautiful that you lose all desire to go on living after you hear the song. Infinite Jest, the Foster Wallace story, turns on a movie which is so appealing or so compelling that you can't, you lose all desire to do anything except watch the movie over and over again. And that's how a sort of revolution against the sort of corporate state occurs. And of course, Infinite Jest itself is a reference to Yorick, the Shakespeare, a man of infinite jest, sort of capable of humor that was irresistible. The oddest precedent for that is a story called Nothing But Gingerbread Left. And it's a short story that was written during World War II. It's not a very good story, but it's about two linguists who write, they think that there's a certain kind of, and this is what Arthur Clarke was writing about too, that you can get a harmonic in the brain that will actually resonate properly if you stimulate it the right way and create a kind of an irresistible earworm. And so they write this sort of this marching song, which you never quite hear in the story, but it eventually works its way to Germany, and then Hitler is about to give a speech. The idea is that the Germans are so logical that something has to disrupt their flow. Hitler hears the story, and he can't resist it, and he begins chanting this over and over again, and I think the war ends at that point. What that is a classic cadence count. These things actually exist in the real world. Soldiers who are marching, so 1, 2, 3, 4, tell the teacher what you wore, or I left my wife in starving condition in the kitchen. I left my wife and 48 children in the kitchen in starving condition with only one jelly bean left. Left, right, left, right. This apparently was invented by a private Willie Duckworth in 1942 on maneuvers in a fort in upstate New York. This was during the segregated era of the war, and Duckworth was in a black unit, and they were coming back from this 20-mile hike, and they were dragging. And Duckworth started this sound off. Let's go, gone. Let's go. I have his tombstone here. What was it? Ain't no use in going home. Jody's got your girl and gone. Ain't no use in being blue. Jody's got your sister too. And this cheered the men up, and they began marching with a pep in their step, and they got home, and they were feeling great, and it was called the Duckworth Chant march, and that there were lots of elaborate, totally obscene versions of this, but basically it's a call and response that kept everybody on the straight and narrow for a long time. And that Jody term was something I had never heard of. Jody has your sister, Jody has your wife. It turns out this has become a kind of a trope of all these marching songs. Jody was another invention of sort of black American culture. It's actually Joe de Grinder. It's a blues song about a man who's coming back from working in a sawmill, and he suspects his girl of being disloyal, and if he catches her with Joe de Grinder, he'll chop them up. But Joe de Grinder became Joe D, and then Jody, and so Jody is this sort of universal character in a lot of these soldier stories about the sort of unsoldierly man left behind who's not brave, he's not organized, he's not army material, but he's sort of behind your back, taking all that you care away from you. And I guess the Army was supportive of this concept because it redirected energy and unhappiness the soldiers might have had from their circumstances away from the Army and towards the civilian population, gave them an outlet, gave them something to bond over, gave them some sort of grievance that they could all make fun of in some way. Those marches, apparently, the Marseillaise was also was written specifically in order to give the partisans at the early days of the Revolution, French Revolution, sort of an organizing song to work around. And it's also, in the Gingerbread Man, they connect the sort of mania of, inspired by this tune to the St. Vitus dance manias of the medieval era, which was a very real thing. Apparently, for hundreds of years, there were these periodic outbursts of this sort of ecstatic dancing, I'm not sure how it manifests itself at the time.
Who's
but
St. Vitus?
Huh?
Who's St. Vitus?
You want to know who St. Vitus? I'm glad you asked me that. St. Vitus was an early martyr, as I guess they all were. But the St. Vitus dance, the sort of twitching dance, could also be a form of cholera, some sort of spastic behavior. But St. Vitus was a Sicilian boy of noble descent who was given by his father to a couple to raise, I guess as was the custom at the time. And at the age of 12, the father came to bring him back. Now that the hard work of getting him out of childhood was done, he was going to make him into a proper pagan man. Unfortunately, the couple that he had given him to were devout Christians. I think he was born in 1291, so this is he's 12 years old, and he's now such a good Christian boy that he refuses to worship the pagan gods, and they beat him and they scourge him. Then they tempt him with a corrupt woman, and nothing will work. So then they put him in a pot of oil and pitch, and they boil him. They boil his foster parents as well, but they pray and they're spared, and then they sail away to Italy. They try to proselytize there. They're put back on the rack and pulled apart, and that's how he achieved his martyrdom. He was 12 years old when he died. He's the patron saint, I think, of dancers and comedians. And I don't know which came first, the Vitus dance as a reflection of what he was doing in the pot, or whether I'm doing the Vitus dance. I don't know what the Vitus dance is. I mean, I think this is the Vitus dance. Yeah. But you really want to go Vitus dance? I can't do. Thanks. Good. Okay. That's enough. One thing that occurred to me when I was looking into the idea of the sort of synesthetic response of that we all share was this something that came up, the boo-boo kiki test. You know the boo-boo kiki test? All right, here's the boo-boo kiki test. All right, which one of these is boo-boo and which one of these is kiki? Of course. We can all agree. This is boo-boo and this is kiki. There's no reason, but we all know this is boo-boo, right? Because it's soft and round, and this is sharp and hard. And kiki is a hard sound and boo-boo is a soft sound. Apparently, 98% of the people you ask this question to. Did anybody get the other way around? That would be kind of interesting to know, but no. Yeah, because somehow we have this sort of, we all have some sort of connection between the sound of this word and the shape that is produced. All right, so I proved sufficiently to myself that there was enough, there were enough ways to sort of manipulate, either in fact or fiction, people into a sort of unwanted, or not unwanted, but a sort of an unrequested emotional response. And the most powerful experience of that most of us might have without the aid of hallucinogens is through music. And as it happened, Judy's husband, Hugh, is a conductor. And he had recently conducted a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Japan in a sports stadium with 10,000, a choir of 10,000 singers, with Hugh in the middle. And I asked him if this was the most transcendent experience you could possibly have. I mean, singing in the middle of the Ode to Joy with 10,000 voices coming down on top of you must be, as you're waving your arms and there's some response to these gestures that you're making. And he said, no, really, you're just trying to follow the music, you're trying to get your work done. So he couldn't even enjoy this experience, which seemed to me to be some sort of apex of the human experience. But it did get me to thinking about the possibility that song was in fact a sort of a form of a killer joke, or I think in Snow Crash there's also this idea of a kind of an Ur language that if you tap into, you lose all control of your sensibilities. And I thought it would be an interesting experiment in a form of obeisance on my part to test this theory. When I was more than 40 years ago, I tried to play the cello, but I actually have the opposite of perfect pitch. I think I have no pitch at all. I have no rhythm at all, as I've already demonstrated. A few times when I played the cello, I could detect a kind of faint echo of a tune that I recognized, and it was actually a kind of transcendent moment. You realize you're capable of something that sort of connected you to a Bach cello suite. It's pretty simple to play if you reduce it to its least common denominators. And I played this cello briefly in the school band, actually, because the bassoon part and the cello part are on the bass. And sort of even worse than Woody Allen's character, who had to play his cello in the marching band by shoving his chair down the street. Our band didn't even march, so we never got out of rehearsal. But I kept the cello. I don't know why I kept the cello for all those years, carrying it around from one place to another, wondering if there was ever a point that would be useful to me. I don't know if that point is now, but I feel like well, we've already set this proposition up as Chekhov. This is Chekhov's gun. It has to go off at this point. But I just need to add one more point of apology, which Stuart will remember. When we were freshmen in college, we heard that there was a junior in the college supposed to be a really good cello player, and he was giving a concert in a room smaller than this. He was going to play, and we went, and this kid comes in. He's wearing a blue velvet smoking jacket. And I sort of immediately felt a certain resistance. Any college undergrad wearing a blue velvet coat seems to be worthy of a certain level of snide response. And he sits down and he plays, and he's very good. He's great. He's Yo-Yo Ma. This is Yo-Yo Ma as a teenager. And afterwards, Stuart and I walk out. And Stuart says, well, that was great, don't you think? Because he knew I'd played it. I said, yeah, he's really good. I mean, there were a few notes that were off, and every so often I heard, and Stuart, to his internal credit, didn't say anything. But I felt terrible about that ever since, that I had the gall to set myself up as a judge. All right. Come on. Okay. Well, so the cello that I have, it turns out, you can't really, I think it'd be better to play it with this still on. No?
No, I'm going to draw.
Oh, you're going to draw. Oh, good. Yeah, finally we can reverse.
Finally. You got, no, you're right.
Would you like really sticky chalk, or would you like a?
No, really heavy, dark. Yeah.
All right.
I got to get out of here, though. No.
The cello broke when I tried to tune it.
Hate the trash.
So I don't know whether, I went to Sam Ash to get a new bridge for the cello. And
I'm not going to start when you start.
All right. Should we go pizzicato or full bow?
Full bow, please.
I don't think the cello, the bridge is so high that I can't get this.
Excuses.
All right. The only other time I ever played in public, I got through so fast that the accompanist.
It's been 40-some years.
It's been 40 years.
They have to give you.
And we did not rehearse, so.
We did not rehearse.
All right. Yeah. Because that would be cheating.
Right.
And I didn't tune the cello either. This is what the A sounds like, just in case anybody does have perfect pitch. D and the G.
3, 4.
Wait a sec.
No, I can't stop.
All right. This is not high enough. I think even I have to have some.
You got it easier than drumming.
Yeah. It worked.
We've been talking about doing it a long time.
Yeah, and now it's done. We don't have to do it again.